Sean, first of all, just tell me a bit about yourself, like your life before working at Crystal Palace. How did you end up where you are now?
Wow, that's quite scary. I'm 55 tomorrow, so this could take a while. So my background really was I was released by Everton when I was a 17-year-old, so I didn't quite make the grade. And as a consequence of that setback and disappointment, I went to university, I went to Loughborough and spent a long time at Loughborough playing football and getting up to lots of other stuff that students do. And then when I left university, what I was clear about was that I wanted to work with people. Wasn't quite sure what that was going to look like. So I trained as a secondary school physical education specialist and also did my master's in sports science. So my first job really was head of department of a school in North London, always with an interest in sports psychology. And back in '99, I was offered a role as university lecturer specialising in sports psychology. And I've been at University of Greenwich for 25 years. And across the 25 years, I've developed the applied arm of my performance psychology work. And so sitting here today, I've just finished my third year with Palace. Prior to being at Palace, I was with Charlton Athletic for 5 years as the sports psychologist. And I spent 3 years working with the England women's programme, working with the under-17s and 19s. So alongside that, I'm the sports psychologist at Kent County Cricket Club and have been there 21 years. I work at Harlequins Rugby Club, where I've just finished my 4th year with Harlequins. And I'm also the sports psychologist for the PDC darts players. So a real eclectic mix of different levels of performer, ranging from academy players in this environment, working with first-class players in a range of different sports. So, that's pretty much a bit of a whirlwind tour through my career to date.
And what's the difference with working with, say, academy football players where, they're young people, they're developing as people, and working with individual sportsmen in the darts arena, and then also cricket, which is kind of a mixture of a team sport, and then individual pressures when you're walking out on your own to bat?
Well, first and foremost, we're in an environment here that the nature of the PDP phase at this football club, as it is in all category clubs, is about development. It's about player development. And sometimes that can get lost quite easily, simply because there is an expectation that the 18s and 21s are very competitive in their leagues. But fundamentally, this phase is all about preparing players and helping them transition, whether that be from 18s to 21s, or potentially look after the loan players who are currently on loan at clubs like Shrewsbury and Bradford City and Queen's Park, and helping them make the transition out of age group football into playing competitive men's football. So there's definitely a difference, because in other sports, whether it be cricket or rugby or darts, ultimately it comes down to the performance. It's all about what happens at 3 o'clock on a Saturday, right? Or in the darts world, it might be what happens tonight on Sky Sports at 8 p.m. It's whether you win or whether you lose. And I think I like the balance between working in a development environment, because that's when you can get a lot of the psychological skills training done with young players. And what you're hoping to do is provide them with a template or a framework that will then enable them to flourish as they make a transition, maybe to our 21s or beyond. When you're working with elite adult male and or female practitioners or athletes, sometimes you're working with the so-called finished article. The reality is most athletes do not necessarily have a background, or haven't had exposure to working with sport and or performance psychologists before. And what I find more and more happening is a lot of the elite professional players, very often, they're not necessarily performance-related issues which are at the forefront of their challenges. They tend to be non-performance-related issues. So I'm beginning to notice a real difference in terms, if you like, of the psychological makeup of the adult first-class player, whereby they're more open, they're more aligned to their own mental health and well-being. I'll give an example. Last night I was on a on a Zoom call with one of the darts players I work with, and I'm in the process of clinically referring him through Sporting Chance, because some of his underpinning performance issues are deeply rooted in some non-performance related situations that he's currently facing.
Is that something you deal with here, where there might be something going on at home with the academy players that is having a knock-on effect with how they're performing on the pitch?
Certainly. We've got some very strong processes in place at the football club here, which enable us at times to assess and on occasions clinically refer players for further support and treatment, whether that be privately through their medical insurance or even sometimes aligning with Sporting Chance. There's no doubt that, and maintaining confidentiality, there has been more than one occasion across the last 3 years where we have clinically referred players from within this football club who've been in the PDP phase, who've required further support and guidance from other professional bodies.
And how does it work for you on a day-to-day basis here at the academy? Do you speak to every single player? Do they book in to see you?
So my main focus is around the under-18s programme. So Gary and Carl fundamentally believe that if we're going to make a significant difference in that psychological corner with our young players, the most effective window to do that is during that 16 to 18 full-time phase. If they exit the full-time phase and become a first-year, second-year pro with us, and we haven't spent time building, developing psychological skills training tools, whether that be around resilience or coping with adversity or setbacks or disappointments, you almost feel it's too late. So it's a critical phase, the 16s to 18s program. So the way we work here is that we have a carousel that runs every Wednesday where every player will meet with me on an individual basis on a 5 to 6 week window. In reality, across a season, there's probably a minimum of 7 or 8 sessions I do with each player. There are certain players that might be referred, could be from a head coach, it could be from player care, it could be from education, it could be from safeguarding, it could come from any other avenue within our multidisciplinary team. And there are certain players this year, for example, who've had between 12 to 15 sessions for a wide number of different reasons. So we try to provide every player with a minimum number of contact points with me, but there's no doubt that there are certain players, for reasons I can't go into, have required a lot more detailed, further one-to-one support on their journey.
And how much support do you feel like you have from all of the staff at the academy with what you're doing?
I feel incredibly well supported, particularly from people like Carl and from Gary. They've got incredibly challenging jobs. They're having to juggle a large number of staff within the building, but I feel very well supported within the building from both of them. Fundamentally because to a certain degree, I feel that they recognise and they understand the importance of providing this psychological corner to help players become more rounded as young men fundamentally, as well as hopefully become professional footballers. And also what I would say, where I feel there is a huge amount of support, is within our own multidisciplinary teams. So whether they be performance-orientated teams with head coach, assistant coach, goalkeeping coach, nutritionist, and myself, but further, we also have a weekly welfare team that's made up of welfare, safeguarding, psychologist, education, player care, and that's where we will discuss and look at putting strategies in place to help players who might be struggling with a number of on-field or off-field issues. And I think I'm a fundamental believer that multidisciplinary team, some people refer to it like an interdisciplinary team, that multidisciplinary team for me is the backbone of what we try and do as a group of non-performance staff. We're not the ones who are out there on a daily basis with the players, putting them through the paces. but I like to think that we all understand our role within the club. We don't want to be front facing necessarily, but I think all of us understand where our boundaries are. And those teams take a long time to develop, but there's real trust, there's real respect, there's a real mutual understanding that fundamentally we put the player first.
And now, obviously, you have to talk quite broadly because of confidentiality, but are there any common issues that players face that you seem to deal with a lot?
I think there are probably two main strands here. The first strand is performance related. Now, they tend to be dominated by the players are constantly aware that they are being watched, evaluated, measured, analysed, and judgments are being made on players all the time. And I think in environments like this, that can become quite overwhelming at times. So I think a lot of the work that we try to do, we have a model of practice called the 5 C's, where we look at self-confidence, we look at commitment, we look at concentration, we look at emotional control, we look at communication as our 5 C's model. But we also recognise that we try to develop tools with players around resilience and robustness. People often refer to that as like mental toughness. And I fundamentally believe that people sometimes say mental toughness can't be developed. You either have that hardiness or that inbuilt resilience, or you don't. Now, I firmly believe you can develop some of those psychological traits. So I think one of our roles is to try to help players develop those psychological traits, simply just to deal with the different challenges that they face being in a Cat 1, London-based Premier League football academy. There's enormous pressure on them, and that's before you even start the conversation around potential pressures from other external sources, whether that be parents or agents or other people maybe who have an invested interest in that young player. So there's that element. And then from a non-performance element, I think the pandemic has opened all our eyes to becoming more cognizant and more comfortable with, on occasions, the adage, it's okay not to be okay. So I think more and more staff and players are fundamentally more aware of their own mental health and well-being. And more players and staff now are, in my opinion, more ready to ask for support and guidance and help. And that includes current players that we have in the building and also current staff that we have in the building in terms of signposting them towards accessing appropriate support for their own mental health and well-being. I think sometimes people forget the role that staff play, and we're just as human as anyone else, and we have our own challenges behind the scenes. I mean, I'm very conscious of my own mental health and well-being, and because I spend a lot of my time trying to facilitate and help and provide support for other people. So people often say to me, well, who looks after your own mental health and well-being? And I think we all have our own ways of managing that. Some people's coping strategies might be considered to be toxic, whether that be alcohol or gambling or substance abuse or other addictive behaviours. For me, mine tends to be being in my garden, walking, being in and around the family. I find those very sort of almost therapeutic cures. My fundamental belief is that if I don't look after myself, then I'm not in a position to do the best job I can for the players and staff that I work with.
And by passing this on to academy players, do you feel like it's a positive thing that will have a knock-on effect in the future? Because all of these guys are going to go on into first-team environments, and it definitely feels like that's changed over the years from the old-fashioned just get on with it attitude from football.
Yeah, I saw a stat the other day that suggested that the number of players who get released from academies between 13 to 16 is now 75%. So if you like, three quarters of the players that we work with within our youth development phase don't even make it into a professional development phase. So I think more and more of our work is around supporting players and and increasing their awareness that actually this dream, this pathway that they have as a young 12, 13, 14-year-old may not come to fruition at this football club. So player care, for example, Rowan in education, for example, and lots of other staff who work, if you like, within that safeguarding welfare MDT are very cognizant of the importance of education, but also in terms of providing them with other opportunities. You know, year on year we have a number of players who don't transition out of our 18s program and become a first year pro. You know, for every David Ozo and Caden Rodney, there are several others who don't quite make the cut, and hopefully part of our role is to try to facilitate them finding a different club, or as we've seen even this year, a couple of our boys, one of our boys has been offered a deal at a club that's going to be in the Premier League next season. Another one of our boys was offered a deal with the Championship club, but he's turned that down, and he's about to embark on a 4-year journey in the US of A on a full soccer scholarship. So I think part of our role is also to make them aware that actually this might not necessarily be their dream of becoming a professional footballer may not be a reality. So I think sometimes we feel it's our job, our responsibility to have those difficult conversations and just make them more self-aware that actually, okay, what's my plan B? What's my safety net? What am I going to do if I don't realise my dream and play Premiership football for this football club? So I think more and more work now goes into the person as opposed to just focusing on the player. And we're always faced with that dilemma, because ultimately our role and our responsibility is to produce players to go across the road and play first team football for us. But from my perspective, I also see a really large part of my role being around making sure players understand that there are other avenues that they may explore one day, and making sure that they also understand that the staff are here to support them and facilitate them on whatever journey they take. Because the reality is that very few are actually going to make that transition and go across the road. And I like to think that we do that really well across a number of departments in the building.
And finally, are there any basic takeaways that people that aren't elite athletes that you could pass on, basic takeaways in life for reaching out for support? Coping mechanisms?
Yeah, there are a number of athletes that I've worked with in the past and still have access or contact with, and they're not always in a position where they can call on a professional body or a professional club to provide them with ongoing mental health and well-being support. So a number of athletes who are struggling, who are finding life, maybe it's performance related, they're not coping with pressure or the adversity around competition, or they're simply not coping with academia, or they have issues with relationships at school or at home. I think first and foremost, it's about reaching out. There are so many wonderful organisations that are now much more available in terms of our public perception than they used to be, certainly before the pandemic. So first and foremost, I always feel that there has to be one person in your life that you feel you can have a conversation with. There must be one person. It could be a mentor, it could be a best friend, it could be a parent, it could be a sibling, it could be a relative. There must be one person that you turn to and have a conversation with that person, because that person can then provide you with a bit of a framework. They can provide you with a bit of guidance and support, but fundamentally identify who that person happens to be in your life, and then recognize that, like I said earlier on, all of us face different challenges in life, and it's actually okay not to be okay. I recently did a workshop with our scholars around addictive behaviours, and I used examples from the world of football, whether that be an Andros Townsend, who's well documented challenges in his life around addictive behaviours, but the modern day trends, particularly for this group of players because of their age, and not necessarily some of those vices that most people relate to. They happen to be around gaming and social media. Gaming is now an official addictive disorder, and recently I read an article that suggested that social media is next on the list to be officially defined as an addictive behaviour. So I think fundamentally there's always somebody, there has to be one person that you can reach out to, identify who that one person is. If you're fortunate enough to be in an environment like this, there are a number of practitioners who, in my opinion, at least are that individual who can then make appropriate signposts elsewhere. But I think from my personal perspective, I fundamentally believe that it's all about the relationship. If I can't build a trusting, meaningful, respectful relationship with a player or another member of staff, how can I possibly then advocate that they change their behaviour? So for me, it always comes back to, it's all about the relationship.
Perfect. Thank you very much.